Hello, my name is Christine Keneally. I'm a professor of history at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut. Part of my research over the last number of years has been on the Great Famine, known in America as the Great Hunger. And for me, it's particularly interesting as somebody who lived in Belfast, that for many years there's been a myth that in fact the famine was something that mostly affected the west of Ireland, and it was mostly Catholics who died. In fact, this is not true. The Great Famine was a national disaster and no part of Ireland escaped from its ravages. And in this small session, I just want to focus really on the northeast of the country, something that has been missed out of so much famine historiography. But in fact, the northeast suffered greatly. And the northeast of Ireland is in many ways demographically different and religiously different. And we know this dates back to the 17th century with the plantation of Ulster, when so many Catholic people were dispossessed of their land, and in their place Protestants, mostly Presbyterians from Scotland, were given land. And so from that point onwards, the history of what became Northern Ireland is different. However, what we do know is that during the famine, it didn't matter if you were Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, Jewish, or Quaker. If you were poor, you were vulnerable. And this impacted on people who were poor in the northeast corner of Ireland. And if I can just give you a few examples, maybe the example of Belfast. And Belfast at the time was a town. It was industrialising very rapidly, mostly based on linen. It was part of the so-called linen triangle, and also the emerging shipbuilding industry. But the poor people of Belfast, like the poor people elsewhere, ate potatoes. So when potatoes failed partially in 1845 and fully in 1846, they too were vulnerable. And the town of Belfast felt the impact very quickly, especially the industrial areas. And one of the most industrialised parts of Belfast at the time was an area known as Ballymacarrett, now the Newtownards Road. And Ballymacarrett was almost wholly Protestant. And by the end of 1846, almost 60% of the population were out of work, and they were dependent on voluntary soup kitchens for an existence. So very much in evidence in the Protestant part of Belfast. The workhouse, which was based on the Lisbon Road, it's now the hospital on the Lisbon Road, also suffered greatly. By the end of 1846, the Belfast workhouse was full, and many of the people in it were ill, and that led to mortality in 1847. And sadly, the highest mortality in the Belfast workhouse was children under the age of 6. And it was so bad that the workhouse had to open a new fever hospital and was considering where to bury the people who were dying. Nearby to the workhouse, the Shankill area, again a very Protestant part of Belfast, was also suffering. And by 1847, the Shankill graveyard was overflowing. And the city authorities were so desperate, they had to seek permission to open new graveyards. So very clearly, the people of Belfast, both Catholic and Protestant, were suffering, and very much in line with other parts of Ireland. Lurgan, just nearby to Belfast, which was part of the Linen Triangle, again a predominantly Protestant town, was suffering so badly that some Quakers who visited in 1847 likened the suffering in Lurgan to what was happening in Skibbereen. And in April 1847, mortality in the workhouse was the highest in Ireland. So again, very, very clear evidence of suffering. But what makes this region different is that by 1849, as other parts of Ireland were still undergoing the devastation of the famine, parts of the east were starting to recover. And what also happens in 1849 is that the British government decided to impose a new tax on all people in Ireland to help those most distressed districts. And this is when the story becomes interesting and when we start to see the roots of this mythology that Protestants didn't die. Because some of the unions in the northeast of the country felt that they should not have to bear the burden of paying for famine suffering elsewhere in Ireland. And so they started to differentiate themselves and to say, we, the hard-working people of Ulster, never underwent this famine. We've always existed by surviving on our own resources. So why should we now pay taxation to help keep the feckless, lazy Catholic population of the rest of Ireland? And this myth became very self-serving because they were able to argue that people in the northeast of the country who were predominantly Protestant were hardworking, God-fearing, and had never undergone the famine. But if we go back to the historical record, if we look at the newspapers for the 1840s, we see in the summer of 1847, people throughout the north of Ireland were literally dropping dead on the streets from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. And many of the people who died were Protestant. So just to reiterate my point, the famine was a national disaster. No part of Ireland escaped from its ravages, and no religion escaped from the suffering during those terrible years. What's really interesting in 1847, which is generally regarded as the worst year of the famine, Black 47, there was a debate amongst members of the Orange Order in the north about whether they should march. And a number of people said, we have lost so many of our people, our flags have been draped around their dead bodies, that it would be disrespectful to march. And again, this debate shows that Protestant communities were very badly affected by the famine. And what was decided in 1847 was that the Orange Marches, the 12th of July marches, should continue, but that in respect to those who had died or who were suffering, there should be no music on those occasions. So again, we see very directly from the response of the Orange Order that indeed Protestant people had suffered during that time. What's interesting is that since 1995, the famine has been commemorated in a number of ways. And one of the main ways is there is now a National Famine Day of Commemoration. And in 2015, for the first time, the commemoration, which took the form of a conference spread over a few days, was held in the border town of Newry. And I had the honour to be there, and it was truly inclusive. So what is really positive is that increasingly members of the Unionist Protestant tradition are recognising that the Great Famine of the 1840s is also part of their history, part of this process of remembering, ultimately of healing, and I hope eventually of bringing all traditions together.
As we look forward to a series of interviews with Unionists about their perceptions of the Great Famine, it is appropriate that I am standing in front of the Great Famine Memorial in Belfast City Hall, unique, I think, amongst the councils of Northern Ireland. It was a product of the 150th anniversary of the Great Famine, when the parties on the council came together and realised that the famine affected not only the Catholic community but also the greater Protestant community. I personally became involved in studies of the Great Famine in the 1990s, around the 150th anniversary. As time went by, I realised that it would be a good thing to have the National Famine Commemoration in the north of Ireland. And for 6 years, as chairman of the Newry and Mourne District Council's National Famine Commemoration Committee, we lobbied to bring the National Famine Commemoration into Newry. I think that created an awareness amongst the Unionist community of the Great Famine, and it is that which we now wish to investigate in this series of interviews. I'm in Brownlow House, the former home of Lord Brownlow, and now the largest orange hall in the world. I'm in conversation with David Martin, who is the District Grand Master.
Obviously, one was aware of the famine, but was one aware of the details of the famine? And the fact of the matter is, I wasn't aware of the details. It was very rarely mentioned in our home. He was very rarely mentioned in our community, and certainly was very rarely mentioned in my days at either primary school, secondary school, or in further education. I have found that the attitude of the Protestant Unionist community was that, well, the famine actually didn't affect us, it only affected those down south. But on research, on knowledge, it's quite the opposite. My own community, who I feel know very, very little about it, and certainly the history that entails in relation to the famine is something that not only my community, but all communities should know and remember. It should be commemorated in Ulster because there was hardly a part of Ulster that wasn't affected by the famine. In some occasions, it wasn't the lack of food that was the cause, but certainly what was the cause in this province was disease, which was caused by the famine. So the effects of the famine were very harsh on the people of Ulster. So it's a massive part of our history, and certainly very, very, very sad that it's a part of our history, hasn't been taught, hasn't been properly presented, and certainly I want to be one who wants to rectify what I feel is a failure of the past. Well, within Lurgan we have a few graveyards. There's the Shankill graveyard, and also is what we call the New Line cemetery. And in these graveyards is patches of ground, simply grassed areas, untouched, and within them patches of ground lie the remains of the paupers and the orphans who died during the famine. And I think it's an absolute disgrace that these people aren't marked in any way, remembered in any way. They deserve to be remembered, they deserve to be marked, and I would certainly wish that in these graveyards is at the very minimum that markers and memorials would go up to tell who lies here and why they lie there. There was many reasons for the famine. But it goes back to, again, it's you know, oh, let's not talk about this in case we're blamed for it. Personally, that's my own opinion, is that's why it was, you know, shunned.
I'm standing in the Shankill graveyard in Lurgan, and according to Isabel Hyland, whom I'll be speaking to in a moment, I'm standing on a mass grave from famine times. And behind me, although I don't think you can see it through the trees, is the mausoleum of Lord Brownlow, who was the landlord at the time of the famine. Isabel Hyland is the chair of the Friends of Shankill graveyard.
We were taught in our history class that the famine was something that affected the people of the south and west of Ireland. It didn't really affect any of us here. We were an industrious people. We had businesses, we had farms. We didn't suffer during the famine. I started researching family history back in the 70s, and I discovered that my great-great-grandfather's sister had migrated to the United States in May 1847 on the SS Venice. She spent 61 days at sea in a 6x6 bunk 2 weeks after her marriage, and in that 6 foot by 6 foot bunk she shared with her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law for 61 days. I'm not too sure there are too many people now would be quite happy to share their honeymoon with their mother-in-law and their sister-in-law in such close proximity. I know there are, in this spot, there are 252, I think it was, were buried in a mass grave in 1847, and there are several others buried here. There are over 1,000 buried in the grounds of the old workhouse. Some of those were buried so close to the well that it contaminated the water, and that led to more illness. The workhouse graveyard, or the most of it now, is a car park at the hospital, although there's still the extension that they took on, and the latter part of the famine is still there, but it is overgrown and uncared for. The memorial stone that was there has been vandalised, and we just, the only tokens to the famine are in Lurgan at the minute are the mural on the wall opposite the hospital. We need to understand other people's perspectives and points of view, and learn a bit from their experiences. You know, everybody's life in this country is not the same. Everybody has different stories to tell. we've got to live together in this space, and that's what I would like to do and what I would like to see, and see people actually coming together and talking and discussing and sorting out the problems of the past, and looking then forwards to what we can do together in the future. And the people of the area decided to research the workhouse and the people who had been living there and their conditions, and the young people decided to do a memorial wall. I think that probably during that time, during that research, that they realised that over 2/3 of the people who had died in the Lurgan area during the famine were from the Protestant community. And I think that sort of gave them some enlightenment and some interest in researching a wee bit more of what went on.
One mural that we will not find in East Belfast is a mural to the victims of the famine. Yet the Great Famine happened here. It happened in Belfast, and it especially happened in Ballymacarrett.
Somewhere in the back of my mind, I know there was a famine happened. I know it was a potato famine, but I think I must have done something maybe about it in school, but I don't have a clear memory of, yes, this is when I discovered about the famine. I kind of feel that I have known about it for a long, long time. I think it must have been something maybe mentioned in primary school, but again, I don't have any clear memory of it. Now, I had an idea about the famine that I connected with the south of Ireland, that I connected with, you know, probably very impoverished areas of Ireland, very rural areas of Ireland. I certainly did not connect it with places in Northern Ireland or places like Newtownards or East Belfast or the Shankill Road. I wasn't aware that a lot of our hospitals now had originally been workhouses, and some of them were built prior to the famine but were expanded during the time of the famine, and you know that some of them have famine graveyards. Also then, you know, the famine graveyard, or the graveyard in the Shankill, where they think between 1,000 and 2,000 people are buried who died during the famine. A large number of people would have come from rural places into Belfast, you know, looking for food, looking for passage out, looking for help. And with them, you know, they were emaciated, they were ill, and, you know, so disease spread. And these people died, and also, you know, people within Belfast died, and they were buried in these basically open graves, and the Shankill was one of them. And I always remember, because it was really, really moving. And I think it was around about Easter time, and we went over to Shankill graveyard, and a Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Jack Lamb, he was there. And there was a number of us who'd been working on this project, people from the Shankill, people from East Belfast, people from other places. And we stood under these trees, and I remember it had been raining really heavily, and when we got there the sun just came out as we were standing. And we were under these blossom trees, and as Jack started to read from the Bible and started to pray for the souls of these lost people, these nameless people, suddenly there was a gust of wind, and thousands of petals just started to blow in the wind, and I just felt, I can't explain to you the overwhelming feeling that these were the lost souls, almost saying, you know, at last we have been remembered, that we're here and that we existed, you know. So that it was a really, really moving, just a really moving event, you know. You know, I believe that most people are rational, reasonable people, and most people are interested in history, especially local history. And again, you know, one of the things that we were shown were soup kitchens in East Belfast, you know, famine help in Hollywood. But the awful thing, I think, about our history is people never get the opportunity, or very seldom get the opportunity, to actually discover these things. So in their mind, they believe this has no connection with me, it's got nothing to do with me, it's to do with another part of Ireland, it's not even anything to do with Northern Ireland, it didn't affect Protestants. And one of the things that really shocked me, you know, in certain areas, the number of Presbyterians who died was higher than Catholic people, because they would have been, you know, higher in the population of those certain places. And the numbers of Presbyterians who both died and fled from Ireland because of the famine is just massive, absolutely massive. So this idea that, you know, the famine didn't affect, you know, people from the Protestant community is madness. And it's also, you know, it's a shameful thing anyway, but it makes it doubly shameful that when people parade and they sing the famine song, because they're singing about their own people, you know, their own ancestry, you know, and it's ignorance, absolute ignorance. I do know that we do have a famine window in the City Hall now, and I believe that that was refused because, again, the story was that it didn't affect Belfast. Why would we, you know, have anything to do with that? So I think the more education that people have, the more reality that there is, and people understand that, you know, so much of our history is shared, and that we can't just neatly box it up into, you know, this belongs to you and this belongs to you. Because the famine, you know, and we know that it actually wasn't a famine, we know it was a potato blight, and that there was other food in Ireland, but the potato blight didn't discriminate, you know, it didn't separate people between Protestant and Catholic. Anybody who was poor, who was impoverished, who was relying on a potato crop, they were the ones who suffered terribly.
When I came here, I started to get interested in local history, and I discovered that there had been a famine in Ballymacarrett. This is the townland in which we are now, which is part of Belfast, and it was my introduction to urban famine, which I didn't know about. And what happened was there were a lot of poor people here. They were cotton handloomers, and some of them worked in farms during the summer, and then they would weave during the winter. And they were on the breadline because basically mechanisation was taking over flax. It was becoming more popular, and when the famine hit, prices rose considerably. Of oats, of potatoes, and the foodstuffs they used. So they had to sell their beds, their furniture, and they became impoverished. And the Belfast workhouse was getting 1,000 people. There were 250 people going to the fever hospital a week with fever. And Ballymacarrett was on the wrong side of the river. It wasn't seen as part of Belfast proper. So there was a lot of wrangling amongst the authorities as to famine relief. So people here suffered a lot because of that. And in the end, when they set up a soup kitchen here, 1,000 people a day were receiving benefit here. Really, I remember a friend of mine, he was a Protestant artist, and he was asked to do a mural in North Belfast in the Nationalist area of the famine, and he did one. He used the picture of the Gleaners, the famous picture of the three women gleaning, to create one. And he was asked by the cultural committee that commissioned him to put a landlord with a top hat and a whip on it, and he refused because he said it was just tacky. And they asked him to put a burning cottage in it as well, and I think he might have put the burning cottage in the background, but he wanted to stick to the Gleaners and have a more subtle approach to it. He did feel a bit intimidated by the members of the Cultural Society mumbling in Irish and their mobile phones, you know, when they're talking to him and things. So he felt a bit nervous about it, but he stuck to his artistic principles. Well, I should commemorate it as a disaster that happened to everyone. People were dying in droves here, and it's part of an economic disaster that was happening at the same time, of a collapse of an industry. And actually the population, the Catholic population, rose of East Belfast considerably because people were fleeing from the famine and from the agricultural areas in order to work here. Also the industries were hit very hard. The famous factories and the industries, the Protestant industries that we heard about, they were all closing at the time. They were laying people off. The flax industry had to lay people off because they had no flax to work on, because it wasn't being produced in those numbers because of the disruption in the countryside. So we have to look at it as something that affected everyone, including the Protestant industrial history of Belfast. So it's something that affected everyone. It's our famine too, something like that. Yeah.
I was brought up with the orange background and all that goes with that, and I can remember the excitement as a young child of collecting bonfire wood and the importance in the calendar of the 11th and 12th of July. So that was very much my background. When I was coming into my teens, middle to late teens, we were beginning to hear the Catholic voice in the north here, people pointing out complaining about the allocation of housing, for instance, and the allocation of jobs. Around the people I was with at that time, that was dismissed as just Catholics making a noise, complaining about nothing. But I did try to investigate a bit my own way, and I did begin to feel, there is injustice in this society and things aren't quite right there. And along to at that time, I was beginning to hear a bit of Irish music, which I was finding I really, really enjoyed this, and I felt there's something missing here. There's something out there that I could be enjoying and being part of, and I'm not being part of it. And a wise man who I knew actually through a Methodist church gave me a wee book. It was Alexander Irvine's book, My Lady of the Chimney Corner. It's a wee gem. But in that, you have the unusual case for those times of mixed marriage, but one which suffered greatly in the famine. That was my first introduction of any knowledge whatsoever that a famine had actually taken place in Ireland. And that was into my late teens before I came across that. But I also know that those soup kitchens were happening when Queen Victoria was visiting Ireland. I know that was a bit of a propaganda thing at the time, but isn't it such a dichotomy? We'd have people, Protestant people actually, being served and kept alive through a soup kitchen, and the monarch is coming on a grand tour of the island of Ireland. Sadly, there's a knowledge of the famine, but very often, unfortunately, it's almost by derivative, a bit derisory way of dealing with it. And that awful song that was sung, the famine song. It's something that saddens me. There's no acceptance that there was a great wrong done in this land at the time of the famine. I don't know about how we might commemorate it. Certainly there's a need for education here, and that need to accept that there was a great wrong which has to be righted. Now, I don't accept responsibility for the famine, but it is incumbent upon me to accept that it did happen, that it was wrong, and that people of my persuasion had a lot to do with it. And it happened in our own community too.
Here in the Belfast City Hall, in front of the Famine Memorial, I'm going to have a conversation with Billy Hutchinson. Billy is an ex-combatant and leader of the Progressive Unionist Party. He is from the Shankill Road in Belfast.
Okay, so if we start at the bottom of the window here, what we can see is potatoes being dug out of the field, and we can see that they're gathering them here. So this woman's digging them, this young woman's carrying them, and this child's helping to put them into the pot. So that's showing that potatoes were very important, and they were a very important part of a diet. And then as we move up, I'm assuming this is the poorhouse at some stage. Yeah, that's where it is, so it's the poorhouse. And then we go above it, we can see the despair, so we can see the rats. We can see the pot on, but there doesn't look to be anything in it. We can see, it looks like the father, and he actually looks to be in despair. And then up here we have a woman who's sitting totally in despair because they're starving, they have nothing to eat. And then as we go up the top, we see the headstones, and we can see the cross there, but we also see the ship, which is sailing, and we can see the light. Well, I think that there's a curiosity, I would say, about famine, and as you know, there are famine graves in the Shankill graveyard, which is something I'm working on with the South Group to try to get that actually recognised. I think it's something we need to know about, it's something that we need to actually advertise and talk about. And I think that everybody will have a different view. And when I say that, what I mean is that there'll be different views within unionism, but there'll also be views from nationalism and all of those, will be worthwhile. People should hear them. Which one is right is a matter of opinion, but I do think it's important that we actually recognise it. Well, I think that Unionists are coming to realise that when we talk about, 300 or 600 years of oppression, which Republicans talk about, we actually recognise that people were persecuted under the penal laws, but they were Presbyterians. The only people who weren't persecuted were the Church of Ireland. I think that is never mentioned. It is only mentioned about persecution against Irish people. It doesn't talk about who those Irish people were. And the Presbyterians were penalised under the penal laws. So there are things that people are starting to learn, and they're starting to realise that the famine just didn't affect, Irish people. It affected everybody while you were Presbyterian or whatever. It affected you. So from that point of view, there's a lot of hurt for everybody, but it's how you actually deal with your hurt. And I think how you deal with your hurt is that you actually get progressive and you move forward and you start to talk about, how you change things and how things should be done. And we can learn that from history.
What we're hoping to do is to erect a stone in the graveyard here in Shankill graveyard. This graveyard has been going for something like 1500 years. It was the main burial ground for Belfast when it was a village, but it also was the burial ground for South East Antrim and as far down as Lisburn. So anybody that came into the city, there's a commemoration stone for a member of King William's army in 1690, buried at a place called Shankill. Actually a stone has been erected for that. Our idea was to have a stone erected for all the people who had died within the famine. And if we could get it erected here, it would show that both communities were really, really involved in this. It struck all sections of the community. It struck the wealthy, politicians, churchmen, the working people obviously probably suffered the most. So the idea is to make people aware that it was an all-Ireland problem.
It was a fallacy that there was no famine victims here in Belfast and surrounding area, and they had records of something like 5,000 or 8,000 people that had died. The fact that there's so many people died, that's an awful big number for that time of, all them years ago. I did have the opportunity to go to the National Famine Museum down south. A group I'm part of took us there for a weekend visit, and I was absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of information and how it all panned out. I bought a poster to keep so that I wouldn't forget, and it was a letter to the Times, and it told you all the people that had been turned off their small properties because they couldn't pay the rent. List, a huge big list. And as well as that, in that museum, they talked about an order of nuns that went to Canada and looked after famine victims and became victims themselves. And I like that human story. I have friends and relations that come and visit me, make sure I'm okay. And not so many recently, obviously, because of COVID. But I always take them to City Hall to see the famine window. I find it quite uplifting because it's so colourful and the famine's so grey.
I'm going to talk to Jim Wells, who is the DUP member for Kilkeel in the Northern Ireland Assembly. He is also a past Minister of Health. Jim, to his credit, I think, was the main factor in bringing the National Famine Commemoration across the border.
I suspect the view amongst most of the Protestant community was it was very much a Catholic thing in the rest of Ireland. Until I sort of started reading some of the stuff surrounding the Famine Commemoration, I would have thought really it didn't really bother my community in that sense. But it's obvious that there was indeed people lost in orange lodges in rural areas, and the poorhouse records would show that quite a few people from the Protestant community were driven into the poorhouses as an alternative to starvation. But I do believe it wasn't on the same scale as, say, the Midlands of Ireland or Mayo or Galway. and hadn't that profound impact that it would have then fed down through the history of the community and been thought about a lot. I get the impression it didn't register to the same extent. I felt it was part of our common history, particularly of course that Ireland was all British as it were at that time. And when it was discovered that in fact that there were members of my own community who had been directly affected by it, I couldn't really see any harm in it being celebrated by everyone, or commemorated I think is a better word, because it did have a profound impact on our history. Of course it led to largely to the Irish American diaspora, because obviously hundreds of thousands of Irish people fled to the east coast of America and formed huge Irish American communities, and we've seen the impact of that ever since. I suspect part of the problem was that those from the Protestant community who fled as a result of the famine integrated much more quickly with other ethnic minorities in the States and Canada and didn't have the same profound impact that the Irish have had, the Irish Catholics. So I thought it was important that we mark this because it's sort of a hidden aspect of our history that really to a large extent we've really just turned our backs on, so I thought it was important that we marked it. And the way it was commemorated was certainly non-threatening to anybody. It is interesting, we've discovered quite a few members of the Orange Order died during the potato famine, which is something I was totally unaware of, so maybe they would have a role in commemorating their fallen heroes, as it were, because there are orange halls up and down the country that have commemoration tablets which mark that event. I think that's important. I think an increased effort, an even bigger event than the one we had already, with greater buy-in from everyone. I think the initial suspicions have now totally disappeared. And therefore, I think the next time round, if we convince the committee to come north of the border, it'll be much easier. I see this actually very similar to the commemoration of the Somme in the Irish Republic, which for many years was totally ignored, the Somme, and then tentative steps were taken, and now it's openly commemorated in the south, and everybody can buy into it because now people see it as a common part of their heritage, north and south. So I think we've a long way to go in educating our young people that this is something that's relevant to them at all. Which is quite funny because we know that history began in Northern Ireland in 1688 and 1690. We can all instantly recall what happened in those years, but we can't work out what happened in the middle of the 19th century. So it is strange, but it's never featured in any textbook, in any history book that my children ever used. Though I will tell you an interesting story. My daughter came home when she was 13 with an Irish history textbook which had a picture of 4 dead Irish political heroes: De Valera, Carson, Collins and Jim Wells. And there's a picture of her father in the Irish history textbook, and he's supposed to be dead, and she put her hand up at the time and said, "But he was alive when I left home this morning." So not too many children can say that their father is in an Irish history textbook, and it's still circulating around somewhere, but whilst it have a picture of Jim Wells, there's no mention of the famine in it.
I'm going to speak to David Hanna. David Hanna is a businessman here in Newry. He is also the chairman of Altnavay House, which he set up to try and reintegrate the declining Protestant population into the mainstream of Newry civic life. David was also vice chair of the Newry and Mourne National Famine Commemoration Committee.
There was no talk of the famine as such. It wasn't taught to me in school. It might have been touched on, very, very briefly that it happened, and it obviously was in the history books, but if you weren't actually getting taught it or explained, the actual things that happened, then it didn't really figure. Music at that time, the Orange community would have had marching music, pretty much basic, lambeg drums and fifes. Fifes would have moved into playing march tempo, but they would have also played lament type music. But one of the instruments that transcended all peoples, all of the communities, would have been the fiddle, the violin, we would have called it the fiddle, and the flute, of course. So the flute and the fiddle would have been very good instruments to communicate the pain of loss through laments. And I would imagine a number of laments would have been created at that time, sometimes by way of singing the history of the events, and it would have been quite melancholic and I would say a very sad time. Of course, the reason why people do that in many ways is not to be playing sad music for the sake of playing sad music, but sad music brings the sadness out of people and it's part of the way to recovery.
I'm standing in Carrickfergus, the very heartland of Unionist and Loyalist Ulster, and I'm going to speak to a son of that town, the Reverend Michael Barry. Michael was born and reared in Carrickfergus, but he spent a lot of his ministry in Newry, so he has a good perception of the famine, how the famine would be commemorated in both towns.
I was brought up here in Carrickfergus. I was born in 1950, and my education consisted in the local model primary school, and then going on to the local technical college up until the age of 16. It was only in later life that I began to understand and learn something of Irish history, and particularly about the famine. Indeed, I don't even think I had heard there was an Irish famine until I was probably well into my late teens or even early 20s. I know that within the Protestant Unionist community, the famine has been downplayed, perhaps for a number of reasons. The fact that it may well have been used to attack our Britishness, because it was the British who were responsible for the famine and who used it to attack the Catholic community. But I began to understand that in fact the famine was much more of a national famine. And as a member of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, where our congregations stretch from Coleraine down to Cork, I'm aware that within the whole island of Ireland, the famine has had a significant effect. Perhaps here in Carrickfergus, the effect was not as it was in other parts, and so for that reason, we don't have any plaques or commemorations of the famine as they would in other places. But when I went to Newry, I was very pleased to be involved in the National Famine Commemoration in 2015, and I think that was a significant event both for Northern Ireland and for Newry. It was an opportunity for us to associate with the famine, and it was no longer seen as simply something which happened in the Irish Republic, but it was something which affected Northern Ireland as well. The famine happened before there was a border, and as I said, as a member of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, I'm aware that Presbyterians were involved in the effects of the famine. So for all of those reasons, I think it's important that we as a Protestant and Unionist community do acknowledge the famine.
I am in Larne, non-subscribing Presbyterian Church, but the man I'm going to interview at the moment, although he is from this district, is the historian of the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church and a man with a great knowledge of the Great Famine.
I am in the old Presbyterian Church of Larne and Kilwater, which actually is home to me. It's not my church, but it's home. I am a Larne man. I have lived in the vicinity of this town all my life, and my family have been here for many, many generations. Growing up here, going to school here, fairly well aware of the nature of the place, the history, the legacy, all those things that make a community what it is. One of the elements of that legacy is a big building. Now grey, part of the ancillary building's gone, but still a substantial presence in the town. And that was the building which was erected in 1840 as the Larne Workhouse. There is no recollection in this community of a famine graveyard or anything of that kind. Those who would have died in the workhouse or the fever hospital at the time would have been buried in the workhouse graveyard, which was used before the famine started and was continued to be used for some years afterwards before another local cemetery began. So that legacy does not remain, but the fact that people were in great need. There also do linger stories of how some people in dire need families would come in, sometimes walking for 10 or 12 miles. One case comes to mind of a lady with a baby, with 2 children, I think 7 and 9, and with a 4-year-old. Now put that lot together. I can imagine the 7 and 9-year-old having the 4-year-old by the hands, and they walk from beyond Glenarm into Larne. They probably did something like 12 miles. That was a long way for a 4-year-old to walk, but they really had very little choice. In the workhouse they were fed. It wasn't the most delicious of food, but they were fed. They had a roof over their heads, they had basic attention, they had somewhere dry and reasonably warm to sleep at night. It served a purpose. It helped a lot of people who otherwise literally would have been utterly destitute, because it's always said that the poor people are the kindest to other poor people, but when all the poor people are in a bad way, they've nothing left to share with each other, and that certainly would have been the case in times. When the famine came, the effect was to wreck the economy. That is, that system whereby you grew most of your own food and a few days' work here and there made the difference and your family somehow got by on that basis. They realised this just was not working. Before, they had been living on the edge. Now all of that had as good as collapsed. Before, the people of Ireland thought Ireland was a place apart, there was nowhere like it. After the famine, the people of Ireland thought the best thing about Ireland is the road, or rather the boat out of it. And emigration really took off. There is no distinction between Protestant or Catholic, one community or another. Many, many people set off. In this bit of the world, the scenario seems to have been to go to Belfast, to get a ship in Belfast, and to go to Liverpool, and in Liverpool you got the big boat which took you to America. Again in the 1840s, significant numbers from this bit of the world went into Charlestown, and many from this bit of the world went into the Carolinas. The numbers going were so large that the population was significantly depleted. In townlands around here, this bit of the world, in the 1850s, the population dropped by something like 1/3. Now, these were not people as in broken, just starving by the famine. Rather, they were people whose confidence was broken and who came to believe that Ireland was no longer the place for them. They had no prospects. Not all, of course, went to America, famously America, but a lot went into the major towns. These are the years when Belfast explodes in numbers. Also, Glasgow, also Liverpool, also Manchester, and that there are significant Irish communities in Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, etc. to this day, begins with the exodus in those years. The legacy of the emigration, which the famine really kicks off, that is much remembered in these parts.